There are a lot of things in this world that we find annoying. There's people at movie theaters that insist on talking during the movies. Zip it. We have people all over in public taking selfies and dancing to TikToks. Give it a rest. And then we have my neighbor Steve, who thinks it's necessary to mow all the damn time. It can be Saturday at 7 a.m. It can... Really? Is he mowing right? He just mowed like 2 days. Steve is super annoying. But there is nothing more annoying than having a team full of solidified studs that have taken you all year long into first place, that get you close to the fantasy playoffs, and they decide to take a massive fantasy dump in your lineup. So in today's show, we're going to look at players who over the last 2 seasons saw a decline in their point production when it comes to the fantasy playoffs. But first, we have some business to attend to. That's right, I have to announce the winner of the signed Jaylen Waddle jersey from a video last week. Now, I said in that video if we could get over 500 likes, I'd give it away, and we shot over 1,000 in like 48 hours. Thank you very much for that support. That video itself went nuclear, but here we go. Here is the winner of the signed Jaylen Waddle jersey. It is none other than Rick Ross, the boss. Every day I'm hustling, every day I'm... Don't get me started right there. Absolutely congratulations, Rick. Do me a favor, send me an email over to info@thefantasyheadliners.com. Let me know your shipping address and the email address associated to your pristine auction account, and we will get you hooked up. If this video right here, if we can get over 500 likes on this video, I'll pick somebody random down in the comment section to give them a free 2023 fantasy football draft guide. So hit the like button, leave a comment down below, and let's take a look right now at some of those studs that have screwed us over in the fantasy playoffs over the last couple years. All right, so here's what we did. We took the top 12 to 20 players at each position. We then pulled data to find out what their season average in points per game was for 2021 and 2022. We then also pulled the data and found their average points per game for just the last 4 games of the season, leading up to and completing the fantasy playoffs for almost every single league out there. We then took the 2-year average of each one of these categories, and we looked for guys who had point totals that were lower in the playoffs than they were during the regular season. Had to remove a few guys that maybe changed a role, like a Tony Pollard from 21 to 22, a little bit different, of a mindset there for Dallas and how they utilized Tony Pollard. What about Cooper Kupp, right? Should I sit here and tell you that Cooper Kupp is a bad fantasy playoff play because he missed all 4 games and had totally tanked all his averages? No, because the year before he averaged 22 points per game in the fantasy playoffs. We gotta be realistic here and kind of look for trends. But let's go ahead and kick it off with the quarterback position, because I have a feeling this is going to be a shocker for some people. Here are the top 3 quarterbacks that saw the biggest decline in fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks of the season. It was Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Derek Carr. Now, honestly, Kyler Murray could have taken the spot of Derek Carr, but being the fact that he missed all of those games in 2022, played pretty well in the fantasy playoffs 2 years ago, he was one of those guys that we kind of removed more so as a freak accident. But make no mistake, the first thing that I noticed before I removed Kyler Murray was the fact that all of these guys are heavy running quarterbacks. Look at Lamar Jackson. He hasn't done a whole lot of anything for you now for 2 years in the fantasy playoffs, averaging over 20 points per game regular season. Fantasy playoffs, nothing. I mean, that's a difference of negative 20.7 because he hasn't given you anything. Jalen Hurts during the season over the last 2 years averaged 23.5 fantasy points per game to then only get you in the fantasy playoffs 13.1 fantasy points, missing a couple games here in both years, a difference of over 10 fantasy points. After I removed Kyler Murray, next man up was Derek Carr, right? Had a season average of 15.7, playoffs 9.7, a difference in 6 points per game. Now, Obviously, Jalen Hurts for me was a little bit of a shocker, right? But over the last 2 seasons, he has missed 3 games out of a possible 8 to end the season, and that's a little bit concerning. These stud quarterbacks are starting to break down a little bit later in the season if they tend to run a little bit more, especially on teams that are very successful and maybe have that opportunity to rest starters down the stretch. Now, lastly, Derek Carr, not really a shock. Vegas hasn't had anything to play for since they've been in Vegas, right? So really nothing but a little bit lower performance for Derek Carr. But on to running backs, because this is going to continue here in this show to surprise a lot of people. Here are the 3 running backs that saw the biggest decline in fantasy production over the last 4 weeks of the season. Over the last couple years, number 1 here, Dalvin Cook, a season average of 13.7, a fantasy playoff average of 8, a difference of just under 6 fantasy points per game. Doesn't sound like a lot, but how many of you lost matchups during the fantasy playoffs where 6 extra points would have gotten you the win? There's probably a lot of you. Miles Sanders, another guy hovering right there at 5.8 points per game. Joe Mixon, averaging 15.4 points during the regular season over the last 2 years to drop to only 10.8 in the playoffs. But what's funny here is 2 of these names I've kind of been in rumors all offseason as potential cut candidates, right? We got Joe Mixon and Dalvin Cook. A lot of people not really knowing what's going on with them. If I had to guess, I would think that they both stay with their respective teams, maybe restructure their deals. But it's kind of weird that they were the ones that popped up into this metric. As for Miles Sanders, I'm excited for Miles Sanders in Carolina. We saw a Carolina offense that made Donta Foreman a thing in 2022 at times. Now an overall better offense. I'm kind of looking forward to some Miles Sanders here this year, but what was pretty interesting is there were only 2 running backs out of the 18 that I included that had positive growth during the fantasy playoffs when it came to points per game, and it was minimal growth. We had David Montgomery at 0.7 points and Najee Harris at 0.4 points. Not a lot of growth there from the running back position. What about wide receivers? So here are the top 3 wide receivers that saw the biggest decline in fantasy production over the last 4 weeks of the season for the last 2 years. Number 1, Chris Godwin, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, went from 12-6 regular season to 7-5 in the fantasy playoffs. That's no bueno, a difference of 5.2. Tyreek Hill from 15-4 down to 10-6, and then Tyler Lockett 12-5 down to 8-3, down in those single digits as well. The biggest surprise here is Tyreek Hill. The other 2 guys that we have listed, Chris Godwin, Tyler Lockett, they have missed some games over the last 2 years during the fantasy playoffs. So of course that's going to bring down their average. Tyreek Hill hasn't missed any games over the past few years in the fantasy playoffs, but who has? That's right, his quarterback Tua was not there last season, and that did not help him out. Can Tua stay healthy for all of 2023? And can we benefit from a huge game from Tyreek Hill in the fantasy playoffs? We're kind of hoping so. But that's something we're going to have to pay attention to here throughout the offseason to make sure he's good to go. We already know that he contemplated retirement over the offseason. He's coming back. Hopefully he can stay healthy. But now the tight ends, yes, still the football kind. Here are the 3 tight ends that saw the biggest decline in fantasy points per game in the fantasy playoffs over the last 4 weeks of the season over the last 2 years. Darren Waller going from 8.8 to 4.9, a difference of 3.9 points. First thing you'll notice, some big names though on this list, but not a lot of big scoring, right? It's the tight end position still, and anybody after Travis Kelce really at this point. It's kind of what we're looking at, right? We got Pat Freiermuth, the Muth, going from 7-7 to 4-3. Dallas Goedert going from 9-3 to 6-6. It's kind of funny that both Dallas Goedert and Darren Waller are in this show as well as their quarterbacks. We saw Jalen Hurts and Derek Carr earlier, so it's pretty apparent those 2 really tied to the tight end position. When it comes to Pat Freiermuth, I know that without a shadow of a doubt, there were a lot of us watching football games down the stretch last season wondering why the hell had Pat Freiermuth not been targeted until like late in the 4th quarter. So this totally makes sense once again. But I don't want to end the show on all these negatives, right? A lot of you are probably going to be curious, hey, Who are some of the biggest names that had big jumps in the playoffs? Well, overall, we know there's not a lot of running backs, but we did have a few guys. Dak Prescott averaging almost 4 points per game more in the fantasy playoffs. Why? Dallas always fighting for a playoff spot. They're having to play, hard all season long trying to make the playoffs. That makes sense. Amon-Ra St. Brown, we know in 2021, he went absolutely freaking nuclear. In 2022, another solid fantasy playoff. Amon-Ra, over 4 points added to his total there. What about Devontae Smith? He's bumping up 2.3. Weird, right? Because Jalen Hurts dropped down, Dallas Goedert dropped down, Devontae Smith went up. Tyler Higbee, also a jump of 2.6 points per game from the tight end position. But we know that there's going to be players that annoy us every single year. The past 2 years, they weren't some anomaly, word of the day, throw it in the comment section, but it's something that's going to happen year after year. Now, maybe a lot of you are going to be out there looking for those answers. Hey, Jake, who are those guys? That's what we're going to be diving into over the next few months of the NFL offseason, trying to lead up to fantasy football drafts so we have the best information possible to field an absolute banger in 2023. Hit the like button. 500 likes gets a free draft guide to somebody who leaves a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this content, if you're looking forward to finding out who these players will be, you better hit that subscribe button before it's too late. And then all your league mates have a head up on you going in to the fantasy football draft season. Looking forward to talking to you guys down below in the comment section. But for now, do your part to make the world a better place. And we'll talk to you later.